today we're starting a brand new series, and the series is called Dream Job. And you may be wondering, why in the world would we talk about jobs or work life? Why would we take some time in church to do that? Why would we take the time to talk about this topic of work inside a church? In fact, we're going to be doing it over the next few weeks together. And so as we start off this series, I just want to explain to you why we're taking 3 Sundays to talk about our work life. Because I think it's incredibly important why we should take some time to talk specifically about our work. And for some of you in the room, this is going to be a little bit of a stretch, especially if you're here and you're retired and you're thinking to yourself, I don't want to even think about work for the next 3 Sundays, all right? I did my time. I've been there, done that. And quite frankly, I don't want to think about it. I just want to say, if you're in that boat, hang on just for a moment. Stick with us for the next 25, 30 minutes or so, because later on in the message, I think you're going to look and see why it's so relevant for all of us in the room. Even if you would say, hey, I'm retired and work is beyond me. Maybe you're here this morning, you're thinking to yourself, hey, I'm not sure if this topic's going to be all that relevant because I've never actually had a job. I'm a student. Maybe you're in high school or maybe you're in college and you're like, hey, I've never had a job, and so I'm not even sure why this topic is relevant for me. Stick with us, because a little bit later on, I'm convinced that you're going to see the relevancy of why we're talking about this and how important it is for you. Perhaps you're in transition between jobs. Maybe you had a job and you're looking for your next job. Let me just give you a word of encouragement. I think your next job is going to come eventually. It's there. God has a plan for you, but I don't know what that looks like, but I just want to give you a little encouragement. If you're in between jobs, today's message is still going to be relevant for you. If you're in the room this morning and you would say, hey, I'm not sure if this is relevant for me, Jason, because, see, my job is one of those jobs you don't get paid for, okay? I'm married to one of those people. If you're a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad, here's what you need to know. You have probably one of the greatest jobs on the planet. What you do is so crazy important. Just because you don't get paid financially for it, you need to know that it's an important job, and we're so grateful. We're so grateful that you've chosen to make that a part of your life and that you've chosen that profession. But it doesn't matter who you are in the room or what stage of life you're in right now or what season of life you're in as it relates to work. I think this is going to be helpful and practical and relevant for every single one of us. Even if you're not a church person. Maybe you're here today and you're like, you know what? I just kind of got conned into coming. Somebody said they'd buy me lunch if I came to church, or somebody promised you that there's really pretty girls or really cute guys that come to this church, and so you came for that reason. I still think, even if you're not a church person or a Bible person, I still think today is going to be incredibly practical and helpful for you. Here's one of the reasons why we're going to spend the next few weeks talking about this topic, this subject of work. One of the reasons why is because statistically speaking, all of us in the room will spend about a third of our lives working. All of us in the room, about a third of our lives will be spent working. The other statistic that's true for all of us in the room is this, that a third of our lives will be spent sleeping. All right, so 50% then, we've only got 1/3 left, 50% of our waking hours, okay, 50% of the time that we are awake, statistically speaking, will be spent in the workplace. That's why I think it's so critical for us to take a look at this topic, and it's not something we talk about a lot in the church world, but I think it's critical for us to take a look at our work life and see even what God, our Heavenly Father, in the Bible has to say about work. The other reason why I think this is so important, not only do we spend half of our waking hours in the workforce or in the workplace, the other thing it's kind of a startling statistic, and one that, I'll be honest, I'm not okay with. Gallup polls and Gallup surveys would tell us that Americans, and specifically people in the Western world, 80% of us are dissatisfied with our work. 80% of people in the workforce say in surveys and in polls that they're dissatisfied at some level with their work. Think about that for a second. Think about it just for a moment. Are we okay with the fact that 80% of people identify that half the time they're awake, they're dissatisfied? Think about it for a moment. Half the time that we're awake, 80% of people would say, I'm dissatisfied with the experience. I don't know if I'm okay with that personally, and I'll tell you right now, I'm not okay with that for you guys. I don't wish that for anyone, that they would spend half of their life awake, completely dissatisfied with what they're doing. I don't wish that on anybody. And here's what you need to know. Even if you're not a church person, a Bible-believing person, or a person that really understands the whole Christianity concept, you need to understand something. Your Heavenly Father, He doesn't want that for you either. He doesn't want for 80% of our population to be dissatisfied with half the time that they're awake. In fact, the Bible tells us that our Heavenly Father, He wants our lives to be lived in a way that's abundant, or that's lived life that's joyful and has meaning and has purpose, that people will live life to the max. That's the kind of life that your Heavenly Father wants for you. So I don't know about you, but when I think about these statistics, and 80% of people in the world say that half of the time I'm awake, I'm dissatisfied, I think that's a problem, and that's something that I think that we need to address. When we think about our work life, for a lot of people, as I talk with them and have conversations throughout the week, as I think about work life and I talk with them, a lot of people, when they think of work, they can identify with this word right here, this word stuck. Lots of people I talk with would say, I just kind of feel stuck. When it comes to my work, I feel like I'm stuck. They might even go on to say, I feel like I'm stuck in this gap between my day job and my dream job. I know what I have to do on a daily basis, and I know the reality of my Monday to Friday 9 to 5, but that's not really what I wish I could be doing. They feel like they're stuck in this gap between their day job and their dream job. My hope, my dream, my desire for this message series over the next few weeks is that somehow we might be able to in some way shrink the gap between feeling like we're stuck between our day job and our dream job. I want to try and make that gap as small as we possibly can. I'm not naive enough to think that at the end of this series, everyone's going to walk out and say, well, the gap's gone. I'm now in my dream job. It has become my day job. I'm not naive enough to think that that's going to be the case, but I hope that by the end of these 3 weeks, we can at least look back and say, man, the gap that I felt stuck in between my day job and my dream job is at least smaller than it was a few weeks ago. Here's the thing. When it comes to people, 80% of people saying they're dissatisfied with work, the reality is that dissatisfaction at work actually can lead to dissatisfaction in life. Some of you might look at this statement and say, I'm not sure if I agree with that, not sure if that's really the truth, that dissatisfaction at work leads to dissatisfaction in life. I want to challenge you to do something tonight. Ask your spouse if your dissatisfaction at work has led to some dissatisfaction in your life. All of us have bad days from time to time, and oftentimes the bad day that we have at work turns into the conversation at the dinner table. And maybe it even goes beyond the dinner table, and it's the conversation that goes for the rest of the evening. Maybe you don't have a spouse. I would challenge you. Go to 3 or 4 of your closest friends and say, has my dissatisfaction at work ever led to or leaked over into some dissatisfaction with my life? Ask them that question. All of us have had bad days at work from time to time. In fact, I want to ask real quickly, a quick survey. How many of you have ever had a bad day at work? Raise your hand if you've had a bad day at work. All right? Almost every single person in the room. The only people that didn't raise their hand are people that haven't had jobs yet, okay? So how many of you are students and you've had a bad day at school? Raise your hand if you've had a bad day at school. Okay. So we've got everybody in the room has raised their hand. We're all on the same playing field. We've all experienced what it's like to have a bad day at work. When I think of bad days at work for myself and my time in the workplace, my mind always goes back to a time in 2004, which was my worst day ever at work. My job before I got into the church world and doing things here at Red Rock Church was in marketing and sales. And in 2004, I was actually working for a company that provided products and services to the education industry, to school districts across the country. And I was their vice president of business and business development, oversaw all of their marketing and sales. And because we sold services and products to school districts, we would leverage all of the education conferences and trade shows that go on all across the country. All right, there is an association, by the way, if you're in education, you know this, but there is an association for anything in education, okay? Teachers, nurses, superintendents, business managers, special ed directors, every single role has an association, and they all have conferences. They're all constantly continuing their education. And so my job in that company was to travel to all these trade shows around the country, spend a lot of time on Southwest Airlines. In fact, I used to tell people I pay my mortgage in Austin, but I actually live on Southwest, and I would fly all over the country and go to these conferences, and I would speak at these conferences. That was kind of my job. And our company, we would oftentimes, at these trade shows, we would rent a hotel suite so that we could do presentations each day of the conference, and we'd do multiple presentations throughout the day, and the hotel would clear out of the suite all the furniture, and they'd put in chairs, and you could host about 20 to 30 people in a hotel room, and had a bathroom connected to it. They'd put a screen up, and I would do presentations all throughout the day. This particular trade show in 2004 happened in Nashua, New Hampshire, just outside of Boston. And that morning I had done several presentations, and I went to lunch that day with a group of the team from our company, and we had a great lunch, probably ate a little bit too much, which would come back to haunt me later on in the afternoon. And so I got back to the hotel suite, and we had 3 presentations that we were going to do that afternoon. Well, about 10 minutes in to the first presentation of the afternoon, all of a sudden, my lunch had decided it was going to get out of my body one way or the other. And I began to sweat. I could barely speak. Man, I was just holding on for dear life. And my boss, who's a good friend of mine, he was up the back of the room, and he actually wasn't watching the presentation. He was facing the other way, working on his laptop. And man, I got to the point where I could barely move, and I could barely say anything. And I just knew that something was about to blow. It was not going to be good. So I walked to the back of the room. I tapped my boss on the shoulder. I couldn't even say anything. There was about 20 people in the room. I just pointed to the screen at the front of the room, and then I made a beeline for the bathroom. Unfortunately, I didn't make it in time. It was the shortest presentation in the history of our company. My boss got up, the smell was horrific, and he just sent everybody on their way. And so I had to get cleaned up, went out, bought a new outfit down the road at a store, and came back, did the second and third presentations that afternoon. We actually got some contracts out of the deal, which was amazing. I then got back to our office a couple of days later, and the team had so thoughtful, so understanding, they had decided to go out and get me a package of Depends, and they put that on my desk as a reminder. It's actually kind of folklore in the company now as I go back to Austin occasionally and meet up with people I've never met before. They're like, oh, you're that guy. So one of those stories, worst day on the job. I kind of wondered if I'd even have a job the next day, but man, I'm grateful that they let me continue to work. For all of us, we've all experienced a bad day on the job. Maybe it wasn't as bad as my experience. Maybe it was worse. I hope not. Maybe it wasn't quite as bad, but I think all of us have had bad days on the job. When I sit down and talk with people throughout the week, in fact, just this past week, I had several meetings with several different people, and 3 times this conversation came up in all of my different meetings, this idea of work and being dissatisfied with it. But the number one thing that I've found in all the conversations that I have with people, the number one thing that I find, or the number one topic that people bring up as it relates to work, doesn't matter how old they are, whether they're retired or in the generation that's gone before my generation, or if they're in my generation, still the same, even more so in the generation behind me, the group of people that we call millennials, the number one thing that people talk about when they bring up the conversation of work and conversations I have is this idea right here of purpose. Everybody's looking for purpose. They're all looking for meaning in their work life. Every single person I talk to, it always comes up. So I guess the question we should ask this morning as we kick off this series is this: what's the purpose of work? What is the purpose of work? If that's the number one issue that comes up in conversations with people, and an entire generation of millennials that are laser focused on trying to find work that's purposeful and meaningful, then we've got to answer this question: what's the purpose of work? And here's another thing. You'll never really understand your purpose at work until you fully understand or you come to know the purpose of work. You'll never know what your purpose at work is until you know what the purpose of work is. So I want to try and answer this question. What's the purpose of work today? When you think about this question, what's the purpose of work? If I were to ask everyone in the audience, hey, let's do a quick survey. What do you think the purpose of work is in our lives? I think we'd get a ton of different answers. But I think one of the top answers that we probably would get is this right here. It's to pay the bills. Everyone's like, yeah, that's definitely part of the purpose of work. It's to pay the bills. But for some of us, it's not just about paying the bills. We also measure kind of how we're doing in life. And so for some, part of the purpose of work is this idea of success. It helps us kind of gauge where we're up to. We can measure how well we're doing by how successful we are in the workplace. For some of us, it goes beyond just measuring success. When you think about when you meet somebody for the very first time, they typically ask you two questions. First question, hey, what's your name? You tell them your name. And then the follow-up question to that is, what do you do for work? What do you do for work? And so for a lot of us, when it comes to work, not only does it pay the bills and not only does it help us to measure how successful we're doing in life, but for a lot of people, it becomes their identity as well. I don't know if you've ever struggled with this, but I've certainly struggled in my own life of seeing my value and my worth and my identity in the work that I do. If we continued the survey, some of you that are maybe a little bit older or my age, you might go back a couple of decades and you'd say, well, the purpose of work comes from that great ABBA song, Money, Money, Money. That's what you would say is the purpose of work. But no matter what you think the purpose of work is, God really has a purpose for us when it comes to our work. And when we look in the Bible, all the way back to the very beginning, in fact, when we see the origin of work and when work was first introduced to humanity, we can actually find the purpose of work in that place. Some of you are here this morning and you would just say right off the bat, you'd say, you know what, Jason, I come to church occasionally, or maybe this is your first time in church, and I really don't identify with the Bible and especially the story that I'm about to share. For some of you, this is a stretch for you to even believe that this is even possible. But I just want to ask you, even if you don't believe everything that we're talking about today, would you do me a favor just for the next few moments? Would you kind of set that aside and say, is there something practical? Is there a lesson or a nugget of truth that I could learn, even though I don't believe the whole story? Is there at least something practical that I could take away from today's message? When we look at the origin of work, for many of us, especially those that have read the Bible and believe the Bible, we look back at the very beginning of creation, at the very beginning of the Bible, and there's a passage in that particular story that introduces us, or introduces the idea of when humanity was introduced to the concept of work. In Genesis chapter 3, before we read it, I just want to set it up for you. God has created the world, and I know for some that's a stretch and that's difficult to believe. I understand that. God has created the world, and in His creation, He created Adam and Eve. And even if you've never read the Bible before, you've probably heard the story of Adam and Eve and how God said, hey, I've created a garden for you, but there's a tree in the garden that I don't want you to touch. I don't want you to eat the fruit of. But along came a serpent and kind of convinced Eve into thinking that if she were to eat the fruit, then she would actually become like a god. She'd have knowledge and understanding just like God does. And so Eve fell for it, and she grabbed the fruit, and she ate it, and then she handed it off to Adam. And like most guys, we're kind of stupid. We just do whatever our lady says to do. And so he grabbed the fruit, and he bit into it as well. And in that moment, sin entered into the world. It had never been here before. And it broke the relationship that God had with humanity and mankind. Not only did it break the relationship that God had established with mankind, but it also broke a lot of the other things that were happening that God had created in the world, including work. And so for a lot of us, when we look back at the origin of work, this passage of Scripture in Genesis 3 comes to mind. It says this, God speaking, "Cursed is the ground because of you, Adam and Eve. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field." And then he goes on and he says, not only that, but by the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food until you return to the ground. For many of us, when we think about work and the origins of work, we go back to this passage. And so it's no wonder that when we think of work, it doesn't always come with a positive thought. It oftentimes comes with negativity when we think about the sweat of our brow and having to toil for the food. We've probably all experienced what it's like to be out in the backyard working on a hot summer's day in the yard. Maybe you love gardening and you've experienced what it's like to work hard in the ground. And because of the curse that happened when sin entered into the world, we all experience what this looks like and what God is saying to Adam as it relates to work. But this is not actually the first time that work is introduced to humanity. You see, right after God created the world, he actually introduces the idea and the concept of work to Adam. Look at what God says in the chapter before this one. In Genesis 2, he says, God took the man, Adam, and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. You see, when the curse happened on work, it really wasn't on work itself. And this is an important distinction for us to understand. Work was not the thing that was cursed. It was the environment in which work was done that was cursed. Some of you are smiling because you're thinking to yourself, I know exactly what you're talking about. I don't mind the work that I do, but man, the environment that I have to do my work in, the people I have to work with, or maybe the conditions that I have to work in, man, that sure was cursed, and it's still cursed today. So it's not necessarily the work that I have to do, but it's the environment in which the work is done that is so difficult for so many of us. Throughout all of history, God has had one central theme. If you read the entirety of the Bible, you can summarize the entirety of the Bible in one central theme. From the moment that sin entered the world and relationship with God and man was broken, there's been one central theme of the entire Bible, and it's simply this: God restoring relationship with mankind. That's the whole theme. If you read through all the Old Testament, read through the entire New Testament, it's all about a story of God trying to restore his relationship with humanity. That's the whole theme of the Bible. And so as we go into the New Testament, we actually see God beginning to restore relationship with mankind as he sends his son Jesus, the greatest act that he ever did to try and restore relationship, when he sent his only son Jesus to make a way for us to get back into relationship with our Heavenly Father. But not only did God want to restore relationship with mankind, but there were so many other things that were broken, including work, because of sin entering into the world. And God is on a quest to restore those things. Our relationship with him and all the amazing things that he created for us, including work. And so as we go into the New Testament, we run into a guy, his name is Paul. He was one of the first followers of Jesus in the first century. Paul was an amazing guy, an incredible guy. He used to travel around all the Roman Empire at that time, telling the story of how Jesus was crucified and how he was buried, and then how Jesus came back to life again. When he would go into these little towns and these cities, he would explain this to people, and people started believing that Jesus truly was who he said he was, that he was the Messiah, that he was the Son of God. And as people started believing this, they would start to gather together in groups, and little churches started to pop up all over the Roman Empire at that time. Time would go by, and Paul would move on to other towns and other cities. But oftentimes he'd get word back from a town that he had been in previously. Maybe he got an email or he saw a post on social media or something. But he'd find out that these little groups of followers of Jesus started to maybe struggle with something. Perhaps there was an idea or a truth or a teaching that would come in and start to distract them from what the true meaning of being a Christian was. There was a small group of Christians just like that in a city called Colossae. This city is now in modern-day Turkey, and in that time, they had started off following Jesus, and they believed what Paul had talked to them about as it relates to Christ. But over time, they had started to believe some other things that they were being taught that really wasn't the truth. And so Paul, in the latter part of his life, he's in Rome, and he's in prison. And while he was in prison, Paul actually wrote several letters to several different groups of Jesus followers across the world at that time. And he wrote a letter to these people in Colossae, and we find this letter in the New Testament. It's called Colossians. In the first half of this letter, Paul kind of outlines for them the way that they should be believing about who Christ was and what it looks like to have a relationship with Jesus. He outlines specifically the correct way to believe. And then he takes the last half of the letter and he begins to outline for them and put into some practical language. Now that you know what to believe about Christ and how to have a relationship with him, here's how that should play out in your life. He takes the time to talk about here's how a follower of Christ should act in the community. Here's how a follower of Christ should look in the context of a family, how they should behave as it relates to family life. And then he actually goes into the concept and the topic of work, and he says, if you're a follower of Jesus, this is what it should look like in the workplace. In this little nugget of truth that we're going to pull out, there's some amazing principles that I don't want you to miss this morning. Listen to what Paul has to say about work. He says, whatever you do, before he starts talking about work and jobs and so on, he just kind of says to everyone in the room, doesn't matter what you do. Maybe you're a student. Maybe you're a stay-at-home mom or dad. Maybe you're retired. Maybe you're in between jobs and you're in transition. Maybe you're not sure if you'll ever get another job. Maybe you're in a job that you love. Maybe you're in a job that you just feel stuck in. He kind of says to the entire crowd, doesn't matter what stage of life or what type of job you're in. He says, whatever you do, here's what I want you to do. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Paul says, it doesn't matter what you're doing or not doing. Do it as unto the Lord. Do it as if you're working for the Lord, not for the boss that maybe signs your paycheck, but do it as if you're working for the Lord. There's another great nugget that honestly I hadn't really noticed until I was taking a look at this passage a little more carefully. It says, know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. Somehow, some way, there's a connection between what we do in our work life now and what we're going to receive as a reward, as an inheritance in our life to come. It doesn't say, hey, if you work really hard and you do a great job now, then that's going to be your ticket into heaven. It's not saying that. Jesus is taking care of all of that for us. There's nothing we can do to earn our way into heaven. But there is something to be said of the connection between how we work in our work life now and the inheritance and the reward that we'll receive one day in heaven. Another way you could say, or to summarize what Paul says in this verse is simply this. You could say it this way. The purpose of your life at work is to show that God is at work in your life. The very purpose of your life at work is to show that God is at work in your life. Another way that you could say it is this. Your work is your platform. When it comes to showing people how God is working in your life, how He's at work in changing you and molding you into the person that He wants you to be, your work is a great platform of showing that off to other people. The purpose of your life at work is to show people that God is at work in your life. The other truth is, as you discover this, when you discover the purpose of work, you discover that every job has a purpose. Maybe you're about to go into retirement. You're wondering, I wonder what my job is going to be, or I wonder what my purpose is going to be. When you discover the purpose of work, you'll discover the fact that every single job has a purpose. Doesn't matter how insignificant you think your job is. Doesn't matter how stuck you think you are in your job. It literally doesn't matter what job you're doing, because every single job has a purpose when you discover the purpose of work. Not only that, your purpose will no longer be found in what you do. Your purpose is not in what you do, but your purpose is in whatever you do. As you begin to discover this, you'll understand it's really not in the task that I'm doing in that moment that I find my purpose. Because the purpose of work tells me, doesn't matter what I'm doing, whatever I'm doing, that has purpose. This afternoon, at about 4, maybe 5 o'clock this afternoon, after people have finished watching the playoffs and so on, all of America is going to take a collective groan as they think about Monday morning. In fact, statistically speaking, they say that 81% of people experience Sunday night blues. 81%. Can you imagine that? So sometime this evening, this afternoon, all of America is going to take this collective groan going, oh, I got to go back to work tomorrow. For those of you that are students in the room, you're going, no school tomorrow, public holiday. Don't worry, 24 hours later, you'll take the collective groan with all the other students in America going, I got to go back to school on Tuesday. I would love it. I would love it if every single person that was here today never, ever experienced the Sunday night blues ever again. That's my dream, is that because you understand the purpose of work today, that you would never look at Monday morning ever again and experience the Sunday night blues. Imagine going into every week, no matter what your job is, whether you have a job or not, no matter what the task is the next day, no matter what it is, imagine going into every single week understanding that the purpose of my job is to show that God is at work in my life. Not what I'm doing the next day, but that God is at work in my life. For some of you this morning, you say, Jason, this is kind of nice for all the Jesus followers, but I don't believe all this stuff. So I don't really see how this is relevant for me. I'm not sure if this is going to be all that helpful. I want to ask you to consider just one thing this morning. If you don't get anything else out of what we've talked about today, would you just consider this one thing? This truth right here. Jesus not only gives purpose to your work, but he brings purpose to your life. In fact, I would go on to say this. If you're not a Jesus follower, he is more interested in bringing purpose to your life than he is to bringing purpose to your work. And I want to ask you to consider doing something. This might be a stretch for you, but I want to ask you to consider just taking a first step into looking into what does it look like to become a follower of Jesus. Maybe this has piqued your interest today, and I just want to challenge you and maybe even try to convince you, at least take a step in the direction of finding out what does it look like to be a follower of Jesus, because Jesus wants to bring purpose and meaning to your life. I've experienced it personally so many times. When I was wondering, I'm not even sure why we do life, not even sure if there's any meaning or purpose in life, Jesus has come in and brought purpose and meaning to my life so many times, and he so badly wants that for you as well. So here's what I want to ask you to do. Next weekend, we have an environment around here at Red Rock that we call Starting Point. And next weekend, after both of our services, we have a Starting Point orientation. Starting Point is just an 8-week conversation that really helps to introduce people to the idea of what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus. Maybe you've just started following Jesus and you got questions. Starting Point would be ideal for you. Maybe you're not sure, but you want to at least explore what it would look like. Starting Point is a great place for you. Or maybe you've just been out of church for a while, or maybe you've been out on faith for a little while and you're just coming back. I want to encourage you to go check out Starting Point orientation next weekend. After both of our services, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes, where you have a place where you can discover what is the purpose of life and how does Jesus bring purpose into my life. I want to challenge you to do that. For those of you that would call yourselves followers of Jesus, I want to give you some homework. As you leave today, our guest services team at the back doors, they're going to be giving out these postcards. On the front of the postcard is the verse that we've looked at today. It's a great reminder of the fact that the very purpose of your life at work is to show that God is at work in your life. It's a great reminder. On the back of this card, it's just blank. And I want to ask you, I want to give you a little bit of homework this week and ask you to go do something this week. I want to ask you to answer this question right here. What's the greatest way I can use my platform at work to show that God is at work in my life? For some of you, that might mean getting to work a little bit earlier. You might want to write that down. For some of you, it might mean actually working a little bit less, because work has kind of been an addiction of yours and you just do way too much of it. That could be the greatest way that you could show people that God's at work in your life. For some of you, maybe there's tension between you and a colleague, or maybe there's a little bit of tension between you and your boss, and you'd write down, man, I need to go and have a conversation and relieve that tension, to go and find out and resolve that tension that's going on in the workplace. Here's what I want you to do. Write it down on the back of the card, and then I want to ask you to take the card and just put it somewhere in your workspace that you'll see it on a regular basis. Some of you work from home, and so maybe the refrigerator is a great place for you because you visit that regularly throughout the day. Or maybe it's in your cubicle somewhere, or perhaps it's somewhere that you'll be able to see it throughout the day and be reminded of that. And then I want to ask you to do something even one step further. When you put it in your workplace, I want to ask you to take a picture of it. Take a picture of wherever it is you put it in your workplace, and then post it to whatever social media platform it is that you use. Maybe you're a sales guy that drives around a lot for work, and so you're going to put it in your car where you'll be reminded of it. Take a picture of it, post it to social media, whatever platform you use, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever it is, and then use the hashtag at the bottom of the card, says COS Dream Job. Throughout the week, I want to encourage all of us. This is something we can all do. This is kind of an all skate, okay? You can search on social media, hashtag COS Dream Job. And when you look at all the pictures that are on social media, this is a great way to encourage other people and just like their photograph, kind of saying as you like it, hey, I'm praying for you as you do that on the job. Maybe you even want to put in the comments, hey, I'm praying for you. But don't make the mistake that most followers of Jesus do. We just like stuff and we comment that we're praying for things and then we forget about it. Take the time in that moment to stop and actually pray for that person. What an incredible thing that would do. As I think about how many people are in this room today, and I think about this little task that we're doing, could you imagine the difference this could make in workplaces across our community? As people no longer look at their job as being stuck, as people no longer think of their job as being insignificant and without purpose and without meaning, but they began to say to themselves, even though I work at a nonprofit that has incredible purpose, or I work for a for-profit that's making a ton of money, my purpose is not in what I'm doing today, but my purpose is to show that God is at work in my life. Could you imagine the difference that this could make in our community? Imagine the difference it could make in your life. I want to challenge you to do that this week, to consider that my purpose of my life at work is to show that God is at work in my life. Let me pray for you. God, thank you so much. Thanks so much that when you created work, and though sin entered into the world and it messed it up, that you are on a quest to restore not just our relationship with you, but you want to restore the things that you created that were perfect at one time, even this idea of work. And so, God, I pray that today you would help us to take what we've heard and to know what to do with it, and then have the courage to do something about it. And I pray this in Jesus' precious name. Amen.